Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to the participants. My name is Anandita Philipose, and I'm the Youth and Gender Specialist with the United Nations Population Fund, based in Johannesburg, with the regional office that covers 23 countries in East and Southern Africa. Today, I'll be speaking to you about adolescent sexual and reproductive health and rights, or ASRHR in short. Over the next 10 years, where do we go from here? And this presentation draws very much on a publication that was done jointly between UNFPA, WHO, and several other partners in the Journal of Adolescent Health last year. And the title was Forward Together, a collaborative path to comprehensive adolescent sexual and reproductive health and rights in our time. The paper really looked at three primary questions. One is, what are the emerging opportunities we must leverage? Two, what are the persistent and new challenges we must navigate? Three, what are the strategic and specific actions we must undertake in the next 10 years to really accelerate progress for ASRH issues? So let's look at the emerging opportunities first. These include inclusion of adolescents on global, regional, and national agendas, an increase in investment both domestically and globally in ASRH issues, renewed commitments to universal health coverage, including adolescent sexual and reproductive health, increased school enrollment that have multiple benefits on ASRH issues, and advances in technology. So let's look at the inclusion of adolescents on global, regional, and national agendas. Adolescents are now recognized as central to leaving no one behind in the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as in the Global Strategy for Women's, Children's, and Adolescents' Health. In addition, AHRH issues are prioritized in a number of global and regional partnerships, initiatives, and commitments. Over here on this slide, you can see a small snapshot of some of those. For example, on the left side, you see Girls Not Brides, which is a collective of CSOs that have come together to end child marriage. And ASRH issues is very much front and central as part of that work. On the other side, you see the group that's come together in Western Central Africa to really work around family planning. And over there as well, there's a specific focus on ASRH. Finally, we're seeing that adolescent sexual and reproductive health is increasingly included in national commitments, laws, policies, and strategies. There's also been an increase in investment in this area. There's more external funding for ASRH than ever before, and this is often channeled through different programs or initiatives. For example, around the work on ending child marriage, around the funding available for preventing and treating HIV, there's a specific focus on adolescents, as well as the funding available to improve access to and use of contraception and family planning. Despite this, there's still some areas that remain underfunded compared to the scale and scope of the problem. For example, violence against women and girls, while there is increased funding, it's not enough to meet the demands of this particular issue. Similarly, menstrual health, there's been a lot more discussion and traction around this issue in recent years, but that's not always been matched by funding. A small number of countries are increasingly complementing external funding with their own domestic resources, which is great news in terms of ownership and sustainability. And this is also true in countries where it's being decentralized, so we're seeing even more work at provincial and community level. There's been a renewed commitment to universal health coverage. For many young people, cost of services is a major barrier to actually uptake services. And quality is also a major barrier, and this is something the UHC work is trying to address. Youth-led organizations and young leaders are key as part of this progress and are leading the push for the inclusion of provisions, adaptations, and resources to accommodate adolescents' needs and preferences within UHC. There's been increased school enrollment over the years with a greater proportion of adolescents, especially girls, in school than ever before. Efforts are underway to also improve the quality, the equity, and relevance of education. Education itself is a protective factor for ASRH issues. And schools can also be a powerful platform to reach many adolescents at the same time, with both comprehensive sexuality education as well as linked school-based or other types of health services. There's been huge advances in technology that's changed the world as we know it. More than 70% of the world's youth are online. And technology is profoundly shifting the way that adolescents learn, communicate, make decisions, have relationships, explore their sexuality, and manage their own health. New technologies have now been developed to provide information and counseling, to expand opportunities for self-care, and to promote social activism among adolescents. So what are the persisting and emerging challenges we must navigate? Let's look at some of the persistent ones first. There's been a persistent denial of adolescent sexuality that continues to date. There's also entrenched gender inequality that, despite many decades of movement and efforts, is still very much in place. There's still some resistance to meaningfully engaging young people and adolescents in their work around policies and programs. There's often weak systems or limited integration and coordination between sectors on ASRH issues. Some new challenges include changes in population dynamics, which also mean a change in family structures and what that means for ASRH. And then finally, there's been a huge spike in humanitarian and climate crises. And I'm currently speaking to you in the midst of a pandemic that the entire world is also grappling with. So let's look a little bit more into what these issues are and what are the consequences of these challenges. One is that, frankly, adolescents are often not considered sexual beings. And when adolescent sexuality is discussed, it's often seen as a problem. I like the cartoon on this particular slide because you see the woman pointing at her daughter and saying, "Don't get pregnant like that girl down the street and bring shame on the family," which shows how deeply ingrained this is. Furthermore, the sexuality of certain groups like LGBTIQ plus adolescents is stigmatized and in some countries even criminalized. And the sexuality of adolescents with disabilities remain largely invisible. What this means is that often the policies, programs, and services that we build and develop for ASRH issues can face powerful and often paralyzing opposition. Furthermore, when adolescents actually seek ASRH services, they're often disrespected, they're judged, their privacy is not really guarded. Therefore, adolescents are more likely to learn about sex from their peers and from porn rather than from a trusted adult. Entrenched gender inequality is a huge issue across many different sectors, including ASRH work. And this is widespread across the world. The issue with gender norms or adverse gender norms is that it starts very early and can often be deeply ingrained. For example, girls might be taught to be vulnerable and meek and modest and polite, while boys will be taught to be brave and independent and assertive and self-sufficient. And this plays out in the long term in the way they also approach sexual and reproductive health as well as sexuality. Those who do not conform to these gender norms often face social pressures and sanctions. And these norms continue to contribute to a worsening of ASRH issues, including in the gender differences in morbidity and mortality. There's still some resistance to meaningfully engaging young people in political and programmatic processes. This still remains the norm, and often when young people are involved, they tend to be older, more urban, better educated, and well-connected. And still their engagement can still be tokenistic and not very responsible. Often, young people's contributions are not measured, and they're often not acknowledged or compensated for their work. And therefore, what it means is that the policies and programs for ASRH don't always respond to the needs of the people we need to serve. There's also weak systems and limited integration and coordination across sectors. Building blocks of health systems are often not in place, not functional, or remain weak. ASRH services are also often not integrated within a broader health system, which also means that multi-sectorial coordination remains weak. So health sectors therefore are not speaking to each other, they're not coordinated, they're not complementary, and therefore do not really serve young people and adolescents the way they need to. There's also been huge changes in population dynamics as well as increases in climate crises. The population of the world has grown, and that also means the population of adolescents has grown, which means there's a bigger need to reach this group. And yet many countries have still not invested sufficiently in their health, education, or development. And many adolescents continue to lack access to quality services such as education, health, and development. Furthermore, we've seen a huge uptick in terms of humanitarian and climate crises. And what that means is that in these contexts, the vulnerabilities of adolescents are really, really exacerbated. And the readiness of the system to respond to their needs is very much compromised. So what strategic and specific actions must we undertake in the next 10 years to really accelerate progress towards our vision for ASRH issues? We need to mobilize and make full use of political and social support for ASRH policies and programs. At a global level, we must advocate that ASRH continues to stay front and central on the global agenda. At the national level, when there's political and social support for ASRH issues, we must demonstrate results and show success through evidence-based action, leadership, and support. Where commitment and support are weak, we must make the case for action using acceptable entry points, using good data, and leveraging on specific events or moments in time that might be favorable to this issue. In all countries, we must anticipate and prevent backlash and respond quickly when it occurs. There's a need to increase external and domestic funding for ASRH on one hand, while also making really good use of the available resources we currently have to show impact. For external funding, we must show tangible results by building human and system capability to scale up evidence-based interventions. We must improve M&E with the last mile lens to really ensure quality and equity and making sure we're leaving no one behind. We need to use resources in an effective way to address intersecting areas of ASRH and other areas of importance that may not be well funded. And we need to show the results of our work on ASRH and how this links to a wider public health agenda. With regard to domestic funding, we must ensure there's dedicated funds and resources set aside for ASRH issues, and that countries have support to demonstrate that such investments are worthwhile by translating strategies into costed action plans, assigning dedicated line items in health and other sector budgets for ASRH issues, and ensure that health financing, including in the context of UHC, has specific provisions for adolescents. We must develop, communicate, apply, and monitor enabling and protective laws and policies for ASRH issues. Where these enabling policies exist, we must ensure that those who are responsible for implementation know about them and are actually applying them. We must create wider awareness of these legal provisions, especially among young people, so that they and their communities know what are their rights, what are their entitlements, and how they can push for accountability. Implementation of laws and policies are often weak, so we must step up our efforts to make sure that they are adequately resourced and enforced, and to make sure that this doesn't scapegoat the most marginalized and vulnerable people in the meantime. Where there are restrictive laws and policies, for example, parental consent requirements for health services, or contradiction between laws and policies, or loopholes in the law, we must identify the most severe legal and policy barriers that pose barriers to ASRH and work together to change these legal and policy requirements. We must use and improve data on ASRH issues, as well as strengthen evidence for advocacy policies and programs. We must synthesize age and disaggregated data from administrative systems and surveys and make it available in formats that are truly useful for decision makers. In addition, the decision makers must have the capacity and the support to use this data to really shape their programs and monitor it. Where there are data gaps, and there would be plenty, we need to harmonize and apply a core set of indicators for adolescent health, including those that go beyond the health outcomes. We need to improve population-based surveys so they collect relevant and appropriate data. And we must improve the uptake and use of evidence on interventions by improving dissemination and availability, supporting decision makers to actually use the data and develop evidence-based strategies and investment cases, and address evidence gap, especially through implementation research on cost of interventions, adaptation and scale-up of interventions, and the optimization of interventions in real-life settings. The cartoon here says, this data tells us exactly what we need to improve and where we need to improve it, both critical. We need to manage the implementation of ASRH strategies at scale, but also ensuring that this quality and equity is maintained throughout the scaling up process. We need to improve multi-sectorial coordination with both usual and new partners by building shared understanding of which groups can be reached with which interventions and delivered by whom, where, and how. There needs to be clear roles and responsibilities for everyone involved. There needs to be a strong referral, coordination, and accountability structure with real power. And there needs to be mechanisms that allow for joint or coordinated budgeting and monitoring. To ensure that these platforms have the capacities to deliver ASRH interventions with equity and fidelity, we must ensure that adolescents are considered within broader health, education, and protection system strengthening efforts. We must move away from once-off trainings to really move to improve frontline worker capacity, comfort, and motivation. We must also strive to constantly learn and strengthen our efforts. And for that, we need improved data from ongoing monitoring, participatory assessments, and periodic reviews. And we need to use this data proactively and differently. Throughout these efforts, we must not let perfect be the enemy of good, and to recognize that the path to scale will be messy and non-linear. Here's a sort of summary of what a 20-year journey to scale up skills-built education in Sindh, Pakistan would be. You'll see that it's been a slow progress with many backlashes and many setbacks, sometimes from political tensions, sometimes from humanitarian contexts, sometimes because of other legal issues that are ongoing. But at the end, the long-term impact would be seen. And so we must not allow ourselves to stop just because of setbacks or because something is not yet perfect. Moving forward, and to sum up, we need to progressively build on and scale up what has worked to improve ASRH issues, as well as monitor quality and coverage. At the same time, we also need to work differently. We need to move beyond the more of the same and business as usual to achieve that the things that we have said are important and yet have often failed to turn into action. Thank you very much. And that's all from me, Anandita Philipose from UNFPA's regional office in Johannesburg.